So I'll be talking to you guys today, as Caleb said, about machine learning in injury and performance analytics. But for us, the entire talk is all about redefining performance, because that's why this is important. Today, we live in a world where performance is absolutely developed through insights. And I know the hashtag from the conference this year is to talk data to me, but I don't want to talk data to anybody here this weekend. Because I think for the last 10 to 12 years in the world of sports science, we've been inundated by data, and we've had no insights. And I think where we need to move as an industry, if we're going to progress the world of sports science and to really truly improve performance, is to not collect more data, because the teams we speak to don't want more data. They have too much. The future is in actually understanding, what does this data mean? How do we develop insights? How do we refine and collect less? But how do we know that that information is actually having an impact? Every team we speak to is trying to use data to improve performance, to reduce injuries. But it's so hard. Teams are spending masses of money. They're hiring huge amounts of staff, and they're still struggling to get there because it's complex. It's incredibly complex because people are not binary. Performance doesn't look the same for everybody. Injuries don't look the same for everybody. Performance definitely isn't binary even for teams. It's completely different for every team that we look at. How they win is different. How they win against different opposition is different. And injuries are not binary. Even the same injuries, all injuries don't happen the same, but even the same injuries don't happen the same for everybody. So what makes this even harder is the amount of data that we have. It provides us with endless complexity and possibilities. For example, if we look at one of the teams that we work with that has the least amount of data, we will see how big a problem this is. These guys collect 33 individual metrics, so everything from sleep quality, range of motion, body weight, collisions, impacts, accelerations, strength profiling, fitness profiling data. But 33 individual metrics, that's tiny. Any of you guys that are working in professional or elite sport here, I guarantee you're collecting way more data than this. They run 9 different calculations on this data, from sums and z-scores and percentage changes and things like that, and they calculate that data across 8 different timelines. That in itself, if we're trying to relate that data back to specific key performance indicators or to injury risk, provides us with 2,376 univariate possibilities for every single key performance indicator, every single injury we're trying to evaluate. And we know that this stuff doesn't happen because of univariate relationships. If we look at that in a multivariate world, that provides us with 2.8 million possibilities. How do we do this? How do we convert that amount of data into insights? It's completely impossible. And we certainly can't do it. And humans just can't process that amount of information in real time. And the tools that we have and the technology we have as coaches today, we believe, doesn't help to solve this problem. So it leads us to the question, should humans or computers be doing this? Well, because of the processing power needed, obviously computers are needed. But the gravity of the decisions that need to be made with this, we're talking about winning and losing games and winning and losing trophies, and we're talking about people's health. We cannot trust computers to do that. Humans and the context that we have and the education that we have is key. So it's not one or the other, but it's both. It's computers giving us the insights and humans actually using that to interpret that and drive incredible decisions based on that information. So can the analysis be static or dynamic? I think we all know the answer. It can't be static. Winning doesn't look the same every day. People don't look the same every day. We continue to adapt and evolve. It has to be dynamic. We have to use machine learning to solve this problem. And the next question that we ask ourselves internally is, well, can it be any type of machine learning? And we don't believe it can, because there's an enormous amount of noise in this industry about AI and machine learning, and everybody uses those words on their websites because they feel like it's a badge of honor. But when you dig any deeper, there's nothing there. And when you ask people questions about this, well, they tell you, well, that's our IP. It's a secret. It's ours. We own it. And it's incredibly interesting to understand that, well, guess what? If I give you all of my data, you run it through your secret formula, and you throw me out a percentage risk index off that, if I can't understand that as a practitioner, and I don't know how an athlete got to that point, well, guess what? I can't use that to do anything with them. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to change it. I don't know how to drive performance off that. It's a waste of time. I don't know why or how it occurred. I don't know what I can do to reduce risk. So we believe it has to be a very different type. So what we do as an organization is we help people to drive performance. But to drive performance, we first ask the question of, well, what is performance? And we've developed tools and analytics to help us to define exactly what performance looks like. And we believe that performance is the sum of each individual athlete's performance. That's how teams win. It's the sum of everybody they have on the field and what they actually do. But it's not just that. It's the sum of individuals' health. Because if they're broken, guess what? They can't do anything. So what our tools do is we allow teams to understand what underperformance risk actually looks like. We allow them to understand what injury risk looks like. And we provide a layer of analytics and automation to empower decision-making. We don't do it for you. We give you the analytics that give you the information, but your smart coaches and incredible practitioners that you have at your teams drive those decisions, and they create the change. So to showcase exactly what this looks like, we've designed a tool that's actually done this type of analytics, and we've just finished a batch of analysis this week, and you're the first people on the planet to actually see this, which I'm really excited about, within the Premier League. This doesn't use 33 metrics and 8 timelines and 9 calculations. It uses 1.5 million or above 1.5 million metrics. There's over 1 billion multivariate possibilities that were analyzed by this tool in seconds. And this is what it's telling us. Performance is certainly not binary within the Premier League. We took a year's worth of a full season, 38 games in the Premier League for every single team, and we looked at the key influencers of wins and losses. And what this tells us is that shots on target is the most influential risk factor or metric within the Premier League. If you have 6 or more than 6 shots on target, on average you will win 78% of the time. If you have 2 or less, you will win 11% of the time. So on top of that, if you have, you don't have to just win 78% of the time, you can drive that up. If you actually have more than 28 extra attacks and key passes and more than 24 air challenges, you'll win 100% of the time. And teams like Arsenal, City, Man United, Tottenham Hotspur, that's exactly what they look like. They're real physical teams that win a huge amount of challenges within the air and get a lot of shots on target. Well, what do you do if you don't spend the same money as them and you don't have the same talent to take that number of shots and to actually be as physical as that? You can still win. Just because you have 2 or less shots on target doesn't mean you have to get 11% of wins. Actually, that's an average. If you have more than 67 interceptions in a game, so if you work incredibly hard to get behind the ball and cut them off, you can win as well. You can drive that from 11 to 42%. And Burnley last year knocked down Crystal Palace, Southampton, and Stoke doing exactly that, and West Ham beat Chelsea and drew with Arsenal. It's incredible. But even if you're in the bottom bucket there and you're at 7%, you can drive that up. If you have enough extra attacks and key passes, and if you have more than 15 counterattacks, you drive your winning to 15%. And again, Burnley did this against Everton, which shows you even each team have different ways of winning. You don't always sit in one of these different nodes. So if you have 2 to 4 and you've better accurate crossing, then again, you drive that percentage up. But if you don't and you have enough ball recoveries and you have enough challenges won in defense, you can actually drive that percentage to 68%. And Huddersfield Town knocked down Newcastle, Man United, and West Brom doing exactly that last year. Well, why is this important? This is massively important for teams to understand there's multiple ways to win. It's also massively important for them to understand that when they're playing against different opposition, winning is going to look different. It's also incredibly important because now you know what key performance indicators you need to coach and train your athletes to be able to exhibit at the weekend if you want them to win. So we know it doesn't look the same for everybody. We've just shown that. So we profiled this out for one specific team. And again, this shows us the performance is not binary. Now you can see on average they win 32% of games. But the most influential factor for them was not shots on target. It was actually grave mistakes. And a grave mistake is defined as whether you give the ball away to the opposition with a clear-cut opportunity to score a goal. So if they do this more than once, their winning percentage drops from 32% to 12%. And if they don't, it basically goes from 32% to 69%. The most influential factor for them wasn't shots on target or passing or attacking. It was not making mistakes. It was actually shoring up their defense and not making mistakes. If on top of that, they actually had more than 18 successful tackles, they go from 69 to 75%. But if they didn't, and they had more than 72 air challenges, they actually won 100%. And they beat Stoke and West Ham doing exactly that last year. On the opposite side, just because you've made those grave mistakes doesn't mean you have to lose. If you have enough shots on target, then you can actually win. And they beat Liverpool doing this. And if they don't, actually getting enough extra attacks and key passes, again, you can drive that up. And again, these guys beat Sunderland doing this. So it's super interesting for us to be able to understand that winning can look different, and to really understand what that is and how to actually drive our players towards being able to exhibit the performance indicators that are necessary for your team to win. But we know it doesn't look the same for everybody. We've already said that. People are not binary. it looks different for every single position. So we've profiled out exactly what an attacking midfielder looks like across the Premier League here. Playing and scoring attacks is the most influential metric for them. If they play in more than one, a team wins 80% of the time. If they don't, they win 38% of the time. If they don't, and you're involved in 2 or more air challenges, your percentage goes down, which we found fascinating. Because we thought, okay, actually getting up and competing for the ball would be absolutely a metric for success. But actually, it tells us that attacking midfielders, their job is not to compete in combat for the ball like that. Actually, their job is to actually do something with the ball, not compete for it. If they have more than 81% accuracy in passing, that percentage goes from 38 to 52%. That tells us a lot about attacking midfielders. Their job is to actually distribute the ball and to be super accurate about doing it. But if they don't, they also can actually carry the ball and then actually win a huge amount of tackles. That percentage goes up, and it's probably one of the most influential factors for them is the percentage of tackles won. That's really interesting because that tells us that an attacking midfielder, in terms of performance in the Premier League, doesn't play like an attacking midfielder. They play like a defensive midfielder. And what's very interesting is that Pedro and Willian play exactly like this. So Chelsea won the Premier League last year playing exactly like this. And the reason that they did it was not because they weren't attacking, but because they had incredible balance. Because as we look down the other side of this web, what you actually find is that they have this guy here. Eden Hazard plays on the opposite side of this. He doesn't play defensively. He actually doesn't lose the ball. What he does, he controls the ball, holds the ball, and then he has incredible accuracy in terms of passing. Him and Dele Alli from Tottenham Hotspur are 2 of the best players in the Premier League last year, and this is the way that they performed. And Chelsea were amazing last year because they had an incredibly fluid structure between defensive and attacking midfielders playing in the same position. So we've done exactly this, but not just looking across every single team. We've profiled it out for one team again. That same team that we presented already with the grave mistakes, we've looked at central defenders and midfielders for them, and we've obviously looked at everything, but this is just what we're showing. So again, the most influential factor for central defenders here was the number of lost balls. If they lost more than 3 balls in a game, their winning percentage went to 3%. If they didn't, it went to 46, but if they made more than one grave mistake, it went to 0%, which is pretty incredible. On the other side of this, for attacking midfielders, we found again, playing and scoring attacks was the most important metric. If you weren't good at that, if you had actually very accurate, or if you had accuracy in terms of your crossing, again, that went up to 75%. But if you didn't do that and you again went back, so for attacking midfielders, going back, picking up free balls, actually behaving like a defensive midfielder, if you're not going to be involved in attacks, if you're not going to be involved in crossing the ball, you have to behave like a defensive midfielder to help your team to win. Now, what was really interesting about this team was that they had 3 central defenders that played the majority of their games last year. Players A and B played over 30 games. I think both of them played 34 games last year, which is 4 short of the entire season within the Premier League. You can see that both of them sat on the wrong side of that web nearly all season last year. The majority of their games, they performed poorly and actually gave away balls and made grave mistakes. At Christmas time last year, they signed this guy, player C, on loan. He played 10 games during the second half of the season. 6 times he ended up in that node on the left-hand side where he performed incredibly and helped the team to win. At the end of the season, they paid £20 million and signed him, and he played every single game this year. Athlete B, who performed horribly, has played 34 games last year, and he's only played 10 this season. I think he's only started 2. So he's had very little involvement this year from a guy who was a regular player, which means that this data is obviously something that's driving decisions for them. But there's a really, really interesting and compelling story that I'll get to on this. So the next question we asked was, how do psychophysiological metrics affect team performance? And what I'm trying to say here is, how does what we do in training, what we do in games, the demands we place on our athletes and how they respond, how does that affect performance? So we took all of the metrics that this team had given us, they were collecting all year long, we related this back to the KPIs that we developed for their team, and found that if they had a decrease in meters per minute, there was an increase in grave mistakes. This tells us that if training is not intense enough, they were making more mistakes because they weren't sharp enough. But conversely, we found that if they had too much high-speed running, too many decelerations, too many accelerations over a 7-day period, that actually they were making more than one grave mistake, which we know for them means that winning looks like 0. From successful tackles, we found that an increase in average sleep improved successful tackles. If they kept acute to chronic ratio on distance and high-speed running between 1.5 to 2, it improved successful tackles. If there was an increase in distance, an increase in accelerations, an increase in meters per minute, an increase in high-speed running, all of those had a knock-on impact in terms of the number of shots on target and their success. If there was an increase in average soreness, there was a decrease in air challenges. If there was an increase in intensity or meters per minute, if there was an increase in high-speed running, all of that led to a decrease in air challenges. This data meant that we can then use that, set thresholds within the system, and allow them to generate decision-making tools every single day to ensure their players are kept in a sweet spot. But again, we know it's not just based on teams. We can split this out per position. So we did exactly this based on the KPIs for each position. So what we can see for central defenders here is that if there was an increase or decrease of more than 2 standard deviations in terms of meters per minute, that there was a 6x increase in lost balls. That is phenomenal. If there was an increase in high-speed running, there was an increase in lost balls. If there was a decrease in sprints, there was lost balls. And I won't talk through all of them because there's a huge amount of data here and a huge amount of insights. But it's incredible detail for them to be able to have on their athletes to understand how do you micromanage and individualize your practice training schedules to ensure that you're driving the key performance indicators for every single athlete to drive your team forward. Now, if we poke at one of these in particular, because it was incredibly interesting for us, again, as I said, if there was an increase or decrease of more than 2 standard deviations in the average meters per minute covered per player over a 7-day period, there was a 6x increase in lost balls. Well, we knew that was important for defenders, and we profiled that out for those guys, athletes A, B, and C. Well, for the majority of athletes A and B, when they perform poorly, for the games that they performed poorly and they gave away those lost balls and grave mistakes, that's where they sat. They had had more than a 2 standard deviation of an increase in terms of meters per minute that week. Athlete C, who was the savior of that team and came in and saved the day and then got them to fork out 20 million, he never sat in that. Now, we don't know if it was luck or if it was management techniques or whatever, but he sat in that middle bucket in that sweet spot every single time. So that led us to ask these questions. Is athlete C actually a better player? Was athlete C just better managed? Did they actually need to spend 20 million pounds on that defender? Or should athlete B actually be sitting on the bench? If they actually managed him slightly better, would he be actually still out on the field playing 34 games again this season and performing incredibly well for them? And could these insights improve their decision-making ability? And I certainly believe it could. But it's not just all about performance. We showcased this slide earlier in terms of performance, but this is exactly the same scenario for injuries. And again, what makes this even more challenging is not just the amount of data, but the fact that injuries are absolutely not binary. So these are 2 examples, and I want you to look at them carefully. I'll walk you through them. The one on the left, you'll see this guy bends over, gets into that rooking position, and then he gets hyperflexed and tears his hamstring. The guy on the right accelerates, gets up to top speed, and then basically pulls up with his hamstring as well. Now, my question to you guys is that, are both of those injuries the same? And the obvious answer is no. And this is why the medical records data and linking data like this to medical records data is incredibly important. Because if all we have is that they're injured or not injured, if all we had is a body area or something like that, we can't get this answer because both of these are hamstring strains. But they're not the same. If we have the diagnostic code from an electronic medical record, we know that one of these is a tendon rupture and the other one is a mid-belly strain. They're completely different. We also know the one on the left, he pulled some bone off as he did that. That had to be surgically reattached. That's a completely different injury. But if we just scratch the surface with the analytics, we don't know that. We know if we have the mechanism, we know that one of these is contact, the other is non-contact. If we have the time, we know that one of these happened halfway through the game, the other happened towards the end of the game, so maybe fatigue was an element. If we know the positional group of the athletes, we know something incredibly important about them. That guy on the left is expected to hit a ruck like that 25 to 30 times a game. The guy on the right might have to do that 4 to 5 times. The guy on the right's expected to hit top acceleration and top speed probably 10 plus times a game, and the guy on the left never. Their jobs predispose them to a different level of risk, and your analytics has to understand that, or what you're getting out is just noise. Age is going to play a huge factor in this. Injury history plays a huge factor in this. Lottie Takiri had 3 previous strains, and one of those was within 6 months. James Horwell never had one. Training load plays a huge factor in this as well. We don't know what James Horwell's training load was, but we know he was playing all season up to that. I know what Lottie Takiri's training load was because I worked with that team at the time. We had an incredible amount of players drafted into international camp. We actually hadn't got enough outside backs to play games. We signed this guy in a short-term contract from Australia. He flew over, and he was in his off-season, and apparently was sitting on a beach drinking beer somewhere. He arrived over on a Thursday, landed in Ireland from Australia on a Thursday. He came out and did a practice run with us. He ran up and down the field about 3 times, and then he got sick. That's how unfit he was. And then he went and he played in that game at the weekend, and the guy was a stud. You saw him. He got away from everybody. He opened up. He was an incredible athlete, but he had no training load. And that played a huge factor in why he broke. Training age plays a huge factor. The number of games played that season. James Horwell had played 14 games on the bounce. And this is before we consider any of the other data we're talking about. This is before we consider all of those different data points that have been collected on tracking data, wellness, biomechanical data. So we approach solving this problem in 4 steps. Because we know their injury history, and we know that a team's exactly where they're hurting. We know that 47% of their injuries are thigh injuries. We allow them to set their own customizable risk threshold on that, because for each team it may be different. So if you're a Man United, maybe you have a way different risk tolerance because you have a way deeper squad than you do if you're a Burnley. And even maybe you have a different risk appetite with different players, because if you're paying Paul Pogba $250,000 a week, if you're missing him for a couple of weeks, that's a lot of money. The next step for us is that the system notifies you. Once you decide that, the system notifies you every time an athlete breaches that threshold for that specific injury, and it tells you why. It gives you descriptive information to allow you to understand what do you do next, how do you move forward, and how do you use that for decision making. And some of the incredible insights we found is, this is specific to hamstring injuries in the Premier League. We found that when hip mobility was greater than 41 degrees, injury rate was 0%. When it was less than that, an acute to chronic ratio was greater than 1.38, and groin screws are greater than 293, which surprises people, injury risk goes to 25%. Now, this is incredible because it tells us about the interaction of different metrics, but it's also incredible because when we look at acute to chronic ratio in relation to injury risk by itself, there's no relationship. So you think it's useless. It's not. It's really, really important. But it's also cool because most people use acute to chronic ratio as a go or no go. Okay, he's too high, we don't train him today. He's too low, we need to push him forward. This shows us that it's not a go or no go. The workload's not the problem here, it's the response. If we can improve that hip mobility and we can reduce the tone that's occurred in his groin musculature because of whatever is going on here from that hip mobility, we can keep pushing him forward. It's not a go or no go. We fix the problem, we keep that athlete performing. So we have designed the world's first risk advisor based on this exact type of analytics. And what the system does, as we get through this video, you can get in, build your own injury alarms. You choose the exact injury type that you want to prevent. I'm going pretty slow here, so you have to bear with me. So you choose the injury type. You choose the exact activity, so whether it's a game or training session that you're looking to actually prevent injuries for. We stratify them because game injuries occur about 15 times more than training injuries do, and if you put them both together, you confuse your risk. You choose the positional group you want to actually put this on, or the individual, and then you actually run the analysis. The system scans the data, shows it back to you, and shows back any of the models that it's built for you, which you'll see, and then you choose your risk appetite. After you pick your risk appetite, it will show you all of the different scenarios that the model has actually found, and then you decide which ones you like, save them, and then the system notifies you in real time. From there on in, you do nothing. It notifies you every time somebody breaches one for that particular injury. So as we pop back out to the dashboard here, what you can see is that all of your athletes are listed here. You can see the guy that's actually at risk with the little warning sign beside him. If you click on that, you can actually see exactly what the model is telling us in terms of thresholds, and you can also see in terms of the value and where they sit today. So my belief is that how you use your data will define your performance, and we want to help. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions if anybody wants to give any. If you do, just throw your hand up and they'll bring the microphone. Please wait until they bring it so that everybody else can hear you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great presentation. I totally agree we need those insights. From the statistics point, I think mostly what you have is correlation rather than causation. And you rather talk about those causations. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so it's certainly not correlation, but what we're trying to do is provide a descriptive insight as to how injuries have occurred. The data sets that we deal with, the number of injuries that we're dealing with in each of these individual teams are certainly not big enough to have huge data sets. We're not talking about huge data. We're talking about 20 to 30 injuries. Trying to provide predictive analytics where we're saying, like, we have a magic formula, that doesn't work. So we have to provide a description of how previous injury has occurred to help people to understand this is what's happened previously. Use this information for better decision making. Use that to drive you forward, and use that to educate you and learn or win.
Yeah. Hi. You mentioned about you're capturing a lot of data. How do you capture the data, like the grave mistakes, the passes, as well as the training loads? What equipment do you use?
We're an agnostic platform. We work with any other data vendors, so wearable vendors, optical trackers, LPS systems. We don't care, essentially, when we go in to work with a team. We work across like 34 different leagues at this point in time, so within each league, they generally have different preferences for different data. So we're pretty agnostic.
Okay.
Hey, Stephen, great talk. The question I've got is, when you look at the performance metrics for each of the team and the injury metrics, is that combined between teams, seeing as though you guys utilize a lot of teams, and there would be information to be garnered between teams rather than just using each team in isolation?
It depended on the slide, but there was the first slides that we showcased were all teams together. So we used the aggregate data, and it was one vendor who captured all of the data in optical tracking across the entire league. And then for the ones for the specific team, that was just their team and nobody else's. Cool.
So the data that you've collected and shown up here, that was for probably a given season, right? Like last season or something. Have you been able to go back? Oh, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. So the data that you showed up here was probably for one season, right? Like probably last season or something. Have you been able to go back and compare whether the type of correlations you were showing were consistent from season to season?
Yeah, we actually have, and they're generally not. They're generally not. Yeah, awesome. Cool. Thank you.